Africa, a continent of ancient empires, bustling trade routes, and cultures that had evolved for thousands of years. From the formidable walls of Benin to the legendary libraries of Timbuktu, from the disciplined warriors of the Zulu kingdom to the powerful merchants of Zanzibar, Africa was not a blank map. It was a world of its own. But in the late 1800s, a silent storm was forming in Europe. A storm that would redraw Africa's borders, shatter kingdoms, and violently change the fate of millions. They would later call it the Scramble for Africa. But if you look closely, it was less a disorganized scramble and more a calculated, desperate race for power, resources, and domination. This is the story of how it unfolded. Before Europe carved it into pieces, Africa was a mosaic of powerful, sophisticated states. The Ashanti Empire held sway in West Africa, its power built on the gold trade. The Zulu kingdom dominated the south with an unparalleled military machine. Ethiopia maintained a centuries-old independent monarchy. The vast Sokoto Caliphate governed millions across the Sahel, one of the largest states of its time. These were not simple tribes. These were nations, organized, sophisticated, connected through vast intercontinental trade networks. Caravans crossed the Sahara with gold, salt, and knowledge. Merchants sailed the East African coast trading ivory, spices, and textiles with Arabia and Asia. Europe knew Africa was rich, but they wanted more than fair trade. They wanted control. By the mid-1800s, Europe was fundamentally changing. Factories hissed with steam, machines roared. The Industrial Revolution created an insatiable hunger that needed rubber for tires and gaskets, cotton for mills, copper and tin for new industries, coal, oil, gold, and diamonds. Africa had all of them, in quantities the world had never seen. But to secure these resources cheaply and forever, Europe had to do something bold, so they invaded a continent they barely understood. Before soldiers and administrators came the explorers. Men like David Livingstone, who was wandering through southern and central Africa. Henry Morton Stanley, who starting in 1879, began carving paths along the Great Congo River. German, French, and Belgian expeditions, mapping lands that were emphatically not theirs. Europe celebrated them as heroes. But to African leaders, they were a chilling sign of things to come. Where explorers went, flags, forced treaties, and soldiers soon followed. But no one single figure triggered the scramble like King Leopold II of Belgium. A king ruling a small country, with personal ambitions larger than entire empires. He desperately wanted a colony, not for Belgium, but for himself, and when Henry Morton Stanley returned from mapping the Congo, Leopold saw his chance. Between 1879 and 1884, he used agents to trick, bribe, and force local chiefs into signing complex treaties they couldn't read, effectively seizing a massive territory. His organization was recognized by the US and others as a governing power, laying claim before the European powers had a chance to react. In Europe, he claimed he was establishing a humanitarian mission to bring civilization, while in reality, he was building a brutal personal domain. The other European powers panicked. If a small king could unilaterally grab a territory 76 times the size of his own country, what would be left for them? The fear of war over these new land claims is what drove the powers to the negotiating table. And so, the race began. In November 1884, Europe's most powerful leaders, diplomats, and statesmen gathered in Berlin to decide the future of a continent that wasn't theirs. The conference stretched into February 1885. Inside a grand hall, bathed in warm light, sat representatives from Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, Italy, Spain, and Belgium. At the center of the room lay a giant map of Africa. There were no African leaders. No African voices, no African consent. They divided the continent like businessmen dividing profit. Straight lines were drawn across deserts. Arbitrary borders were carved through villages and fields. Lines cut ethnic and linguistic groups in half. At the conference, Leopold's shrewd diplomacy paid off. He had seized the land before the meeting, and the conference provided the legitimacy. The European powers formally recognized his claim, establishing the territory as the Congo Free State, his own personal possession in 1885. From that moment, the scramble for Africa became official, a legal frenzy of land grabbing that unleashed 20 years of violent conquest. Britain's dream was a complete highway of colonies stretching from Cairo in the north to Cape Town in the south. The British conquered and annexed vast territories, including Egypt, Sudan, Kenya, Uganda, Zambia, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Nigeria, and Ghana. They launched campaigns across West Africa, fighting for separate wars against the defiant Ashanti across the Gold Coast. They clashed with various powerful African states, including the Sokoto Caliphate in Nigeria in the years around 1900, steadily crushing resistance. When the dust settled, the European power with the largest territorial holdings would be France, with Britain coming a close second. France wanted an empire stretching across the entire western part of the continent, covering the Sahara and Sahel. They marched into Senegal, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Ivory Coast, Benin, Chad, Central Africa, and Madagascar. And when powerful African rulers resisted, like the great warrior Samori Touré of the Wassoulou Empire, who fought the French for 16 years until his capture in 1898, France responded with scorched earth tactics. Villages burned, crops destroyed, armies overwhelmed by sheer numbers and the destructive power of modern rifles. Germany, newly unified and eager for global prestige, claimed its own empire in Africa. It took control of lands that would later become Namibia, Tanzania, Cameroon, and Togo. But in Namibia, the Hero and Nama people refused to surrender their land. They rose in defiance against the violent seizures. Germany's answer was brutal. It unleashed one of the first genocides of the 20th century. Tens of thousands of Hero and Nama were driven into the unforgiving desert, where many died of thirst, starvation, and relentless pursuit. Portugal fought fiercely to enforce its claims over old territories like Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. Italy tried to conquer Ethiopia, but in 1896, at the Battle of Adwa, Ethiopian forces led by Emperor Menelik II defeated them decisively and completely. It was a staggering victory that echoed across the world, proving that an organized African state, with modern weapons, could defend its sovereignty. Ethiopia remained the only major state to escape the scramble. Though Europe had modern weapons, Africa did not simply surrender to the invaders. There were heroes everywhere. Queen Yaa Asantewaa, leading the Ashanti War of the Golden Stool against the British in 1900. Samori Touré, fighting the French with brilliant, decade-long guerrilla warfare until 1898. Kabaka Mwanga of Buganda, resisting British domination in the east. These were not small skirmishes, they were wars that shook the confidence of empires. The scramble for Africa carved wounds that still shaped the continent. European rule meant systemic forced labor to extract resource, crushing heavy taxes payable only in colonial currency, widespread land seizures, ruthless cultural suppression, destructive divide and rule tactics that turned African groups against one another, and the utter exploitation of resources. In the Congo Free State alone, under Leopold's personal rule, millions died through a horrific system of rubber extraction and starvation. The borders drawn in Berlin forced rivals into one country and split families across different colonies. These artificial, European-created borders are tragically still responsible for many internal African conflicts today. But history didn't end with conquest. Across Africa, a new spirit was rising. In time, the children and grandchildren of the colonized would organize, protest, and demand their land back. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, Patrice Lumumba, Julius Nyerere, Amilcar Cabral, and Nelson Mandela would reshape the continent again, this time on African terms. The scramble took less than 30 years. But its catastrophic consequences lasted a century. The scramble for Africa was not just about maps or borders. It was about people, lives uprooted, kingdoms erased, voices silenced. But it is also an undeniable story of resilience, of empires that resisted, of leaders who fought, and of nations that rose from the ashes of conquest. Understanding the scramble is not about laying blame on the past. It is about fundamentally understanding the present. Because the world we live in today was shaped in those 30 chaotic, violent years, roughly 1884 to 1914. And Africa, despite the scars, despite the continuing challenges, continues to rise.